This is part 2 of the Chapter 18 lectures, and we're starting with slide number 15. I already said this, the kidney, each kidney, the outer layer of that kidney is called the renal cortex, and the inner layer is called the renal medulla. Okay, now the nephrons are the individual filtering units of the kidney. There's about 1.25 million nephrons in each kidney, so about 2.5 million nephrons total. And urine production begins in the nephrons, and the nephrons actually, it also ends in the nephrons because the nephrons produce the urine. And let's see, there's just notes here about the structures that I already mentioned to you. Once the urine is produced in the nephron, it drains into the minor calyx first, and then the major calyx, and then the renal pelvis, and then the ureter. Now, blood supply to the kidneys, we're going to go over it first in the picture, and then figure 18-4. But then I'm going to give you the notes on it because that is something that you may have to list the blood vessels and the blood supply from the time like the renal artery enters the kidney and then branches many times. So you need to name the branches of the arteries and veins. So blood enters the kidney through the renal artery, as you see here. And then there's several branches of the arteries. And then the arteries, of course, drain in capillaries. And then the capillaries drain into veins. And all of the veins end up collecting and leaving through the renal vein. They end up merging with the renal vein. So if we just name the blood vessels, starting with the renal artery. So we have renal artery, and then we have the segmental arteries. Okay, so renal arteries, segmental arteries, and then I'll come down here because this is where the segmental arteries branch into the interlobar arteries, and then the interlobar arteries branch into the arcuate veins, which are the ones that kind of curve here around the top of that pyramid. So you've got renal artery, segmental artery, and then the segmental arteries branch into the interlobar arteries, and those form or branch into the arcuate arteries, and then those branch into the arteries that you see that are in the cortex. They're called cortical radiate arteries. Cortical radiate arteries. Now, at this point, the blood is going to enter into the nephrons, and the nephrons contain blood vessels called capillaries. So once the urine is produced, then there's going to be blood that drains into, after it's been filtered, it's going to drain into the veins alongside the cortical radiate arteries. So there's cortical radiate arteries, and then alongside those are cortical radiate veins. Now let's trace the pathway that blood flows from those cortical radiate veins all the way back to the renal vein. So we have cortical radiate veins, we have arcuate veins, which are these, and then we have interlobar veins, and we have no segmental veins. We just have interlobar veins that merge into the renal vein. Now let's look at the enlarged view of some of the blood vessels just so you can see them better. So we know that the renal artery branches into segmental arteries, and those branch into the interlobar arteries. And now you can see a little bit better the arcuate arteries and the cortical radiate arteries in the cortex. And then the capillaries of the nephrons. Then the blood drains into the cortical radiate veins, the arcuate veins, the interlobar veins. There are no segmental veins. There are segmental arteries, but no segmental veins. The interlobar veins drain directly into the renal vein. So that is the pathway of blood flow, and here are the notes. You don't have to copy everything, but you need to know the order, starting with renal artery, ending with renal vein. So you need to know the words in bold, the terms in bold. So you've got renal artery, then the blood branches into the segmental arteries, interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, cortical radiate arteries. And then this part we didn't go over yet, but the blood supply to the nephron starts with the afferent arterioles, and then the glomerular capillaries, and then blood exits the nephron through the efferent arterioles. And then there are peritubular capillaries that surround each nephron. So all of these, starting with the afferent arterioles all the way to the peritubular capillaries, is the blood supply to the nephron itself. Okay, so now that the blood has been filtered through the nephron and urine production has begun, the blood is going to drain into cortical radiate veins, and then arcuate veins, interlobar veins, and then the renal veins. So that is the list of the blood flow, the pathway of blood flow through the kidney. There are two types of nephrons. We're talking about that there's like 2.5 million nephrons total. There are two types. The nephrons that are, most of the nephron is actually in the cortex. They're called cortical nephrons. We are going to focus on the juxtamedullary nephrons, which have a nephron loop that extends down into deep into the medulla of the kidney. And there are capillaries, peritubular capillaries, that connect to another set of capillaries that run parallel to the nephron loops. And these capillaries are called the vasa recta. So cortical nephrons don't have vasa recta. Only the juxtamedullary nephrons do, because the vasa recta are the capillaries that run parallel to the nephron loops that travel deep into the medulla. Okay. Now we are going to look at the nephron itself. Okay. First, we'll do the blood supply to the nephron, and then we'll talk about the nephron structures. Okay, so in fact, let's just talk about the nephron is the purple structure. Okay, so the nephron, urine production begins here in the nephron. This is called the renal corpuscle, and this is where filtration of the blood occurs. And then the filtrate that's produced is collected in the purple cup-shaped structure here. It's filtered out of this kind of cluster of blood vessels called the glomerulus into this purple collection cup, and that's called the glomerular capsule. And then the filtrate, which is going to have to be modified before we call it urine, the filtrate travels into it leaves here and it travels into the proximal convoluted tubule, down the nephron loops called the descending limb, and then up the ascending limb. And now you get to another collection of tubules called the DCT, or distal convoluted tubule. And the DCT empties into the collecting duct. So the structure in purple is your nephron, and that is what is producing the urine. So any fluid inside is either called filtrate or urine. And then the red structures are the capillaries, which of course contain blood. So let's just go over the pathway of blood flow through the nephron, and then we will talk about the nephron itself at a later slide. But blood enters the nephron through the afferent arteriole. Then the renal corpuscle contains this collection of capillaries called the glomerulus. And the glomerulus ends up merging into the efferent arteriole. That's where the blood leaves the renal corpuscle. So blood that enters the renal corpuscle through the afferent arteriole, this is the blood that is filtered, okay? And everything is filtered out of the blood at this point, except the red blood cells, the large blood cells and platelets, and then also large proteins. But all the other solutes and the water is filtered out of the blood at this point. Anyway, the efferent arteriole travels and merges with the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. And then the vasa recta, which, I'm sorry, we're looking at a cortical nephron here. This one is a juxtamedullary. So juxtamedullary nephron has vasa recta that run parallel to the actual nephron loop. Okay, and then the blood in the vasa recta ends up draining into the cortical radiate veins, and then the pathway that we've already gone over, all the way back to the renal vein. So let's talk about the nephrons. Nephrons are the basic functional units of the kidneys. They consist of two parts, the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle is where filtration occurs, and it contains the it's called the Bowman's capsule, but also the glomerular capsule, and I think this book uses the term glomerular capsule. That's where the filtrate is collected, and then the glomerulus is the name for the blood vessels inside of the renal corpuscle. It's just like a collection of blood vessels that are all in a little knot or ball, you know. The renal tubule is going to be from the PCT all the way to the DCT. So it's the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule. And here we have something that we can look at, and you can see those structures a little better. So the nephron begins with the renal corpuscle. That is where filtrate is produced, and it's where filtration occurs. You can see the glomerulus is the blood vessels, the capillaries. And then this round cup-shaped structure is the glomerular capsule. Okay. Then you have the proximal convoluted tubule, the descending limb of the nephron loop, the ascending limb of the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule, and then by this point we call the filtrate urine, and it collects in the collecting duct, papillary duct, and then your minor calyx. Okay, the notes on the renal corpuscle is where the blood supply contacts the nephron. It's where the blood is filtered into the collecting portion of the nephron. The renal corpuscle consists of the glomerular capsule, which is what collects the filtrate from the blood, and the glomerulus, which is the name for the capillaries. Then we have, the only other thing I just want to say is the process that occurs in the renal corpuscle is called filtration. And the fluid that's produced that collects in the glomerular capsule is called filtrate. It's not called urine yet because it's not been concentrated enough and it's not been adjusted. It's just called filtrate. Now, the filtrate flows into the renal tubule, starting with the PCT, then the nephron loop, then the DCT. At the end, you call it tubular fluid. When the filtrate has arrived at the DCT, it's called tubular fluid. And the collecting ducts, the collecting system would be, so after the DCT, the tubular fluid enters the collecting duct and the papillary ducts. Once the fluid leaves the papillary ducts and enters the minor calyces, it is now called urine. So it's got three names: filtrate, tubular fluid, and urine. And it's called filtrate from the entire time that it's in the nephron. It's called tubular fluid when it's in the collecting system, the collecting duct and the papillary ducts. And it's called urine when it enters the minor calyces. And here is a very good picture of just the renal corpuscle, but there's a lot in this illustration here I want to go over with you. You can see here that the glomerulus, which is your network of blood vessels that's inside of this glomerular capsule, is surrounded by this purple membrane. So if you can look at the purple cup-shaped structure here that's called the glomerular capsule. You can see that it has two layers like any of our serous membranes. Remember, we have three serous membranes. One is called the pericardium and surrounds the heart. One is called the pleura and it surrounds each lung. And the other is called the peritoneum and it surrounds the abdominal organs. So every serous membrane has a parietal layer, which is this layer. This is the layer on the outside. And then a visceral layer that contacts the organs. In this case, this visceral layer contacts the capillaries of the glomerulus. So, and it actually does more than contact. They're attached to one another. But notice how the visceral, this would be visceral peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum actually forms these slits. It forms these filtration slits, and so those are the openings through which the blood is filtered. So what you can also see here is this portion of the DCT. This is actually the distal convoluted tubule that's coming up through and contacting the afferent and the efferent arteriole. Well, at this area, we call this the juxtaglomerular complex. And there are cells that monitor conditions in the blood and also in the filtrate. Here's the macula densa cells, which are the cells of the distal convoluted tubule that actually contact the afferent and efferent arterioles. And then there are the juxtaglomerular cells, which are cells that are attached directly and are part of the afferent and efferent arterioles. Okay, so if you look at the picture over here, you can see, so this opening is one of those blood vessels of the glomerulus, and this is another opening. You can see that where the purple membrane, which is the visceral peritoneum, where it contacts the blood vessels, it forms these filtration slits, and basically the cells of this visceral peritoneum have extensions called podocytes. So it's the podocytes that wrap around the capillaries and form the filtration slits. And then the blood vessels themselves, the capillaries themselves, have pores. So that is where the blood is filtered through. It's called the filtration membrane. The filtration membrane consists of the capillary endothelium, which just is the lining of the blood capillaries. It's simple squamous epithelial tissue, but we call it endothelium. There's a basement membrane attached to the endothelium of the capillary. There's also a basement membrane attached to the portion of the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. So there's two basement membranes, and then there's also the visceral peritoneum, which is formed around the blood vessels. That's part of the glomerular capsule itself. So you have three portions of the membrane. You have the tissue that forms the capillary lining. You have the tissue that forms the lining from the nephron that surrounds the capillaries. And both of those linings have a basement membrane. So there's a basement membrane in between. But it's still very thin. So the blood is filtered out through those filtration slits and collects in this capsular space, which is why they've colored it yellow, because, urine being yellow, even though this is filtrate. So we're going to stop here. We didn't get very far, but I explained a lot. So we stopped with slide 26, and we'll start with slide 27 in the next recording.